On a wind-cut stretch of the Baltic coast, archaeologists once lifted a pig's jaw from a layer of shells, charcoal, and discarded bone left behind by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. It did not look like a revolution. It looked like refuse. Damp, brown, ordinary. But one detail hidden inside that animal would prove strangely out of place. When scientists eventually tested it, they found signs that this pig had carried traits associated not with the wild forests of northern Europe, but with domestication. One specimen even pointed to a black-spotted coat, the kind of visual marker that belongs to managed herds, not untouched wilderness. And that raised a quiet, destabilizing question. What was a domestic pig doing here, among people who were not supposed to have been farmers yet? For a long time, the origin story of pigs sounded simple enough to survive repetition. Wild boar were domesticated in a handful of early farming centers. From there, domestic pigs spread with people, following the rise of villages, agriculture, and settled life. In Europe, the usual picture placed the beginning elsewhere, in the Near East, where some of the earliest farmers were already living with sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Those pigs, the story went, entered Europe with the first agricultural communities and eventually became the ancestors of the domestic pigs we know today. It was neat, geographic, directional, almost clean. But clean stories are often the first thing ancient DNA destroys. What genetics began to show, first in fragments of mitochondrial DNA and later across much larger portions of the genome, was not a single unbroken line from origin to outcome. It was movement, replacement, interbreeding, disappearance. Pigs had not simply been domesticated and carried west like sealed packages of biology. They had entered new landscapes, met new wild populations, mixed with them again and again, and in some regions changed so profoundly that their original ancestry was nearly erased. That Baltic jaw was not just a curiosity. It was a warning from the past. The old map was wrong. To understand why, we have to go farther south and much farther back, to the early villages of Southwest Asia, where the relationship between humans and wild boar appears to have shifted more than 10,000 years ago. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that pigs were among the animals drawn into the orbit of early farming societies in the Near East around the 9th millennium BC. But even here, the process does not look like a dramatic human triumph over nature. It looks slower, messier, and more mutual than that. Wild boar are intelligent, opportunistic omnivores. They thrive around edges, fields, waste, disturbed ground, places where human settlement creates new food. In that sense, pig domestication may have begun not with fences, but with tolerance. Not with mastery, but with proximity. Animals that fed near human communities could gradually become accustomed to them. People, in turn, could begin controlling breeding, culling, movement, and diet. This is one reason domestication is increasingly understood not as a single event, but as a long entanglement. A pig does not become domestic in a moment. A population changes across generations, and even then the boundary between wild and domestic can remain alarmingly porous. That porosity turned out to be the key to the whole mystery. Ancient DNA from pig remains across the Near East and Europe showed that the earliest domestic pigs entering Europe did indeed carry Near Eastern ancestry. In other words, the first great assumption was partly correct: pigs were brought westward with early farmers. Around 8,500 years ago, as agriculture spread into Europe, pigs came with it. But that was only the beginning of the story, not its conclusion. Because once those imported pigs arrived in Europe, they encountered European wild boar. And Europe was full of them. Unlike animals that remain tightly confined, pigs are difficult to keep in neat isolation, especially in early agricultural systems. They can be herded, but they also roam. They forage in woodland. They slip between the cultivated world and the untamed one with unusual ease. Wild boars still enter domestic herds today. In prehistory, when the distance between village and forest could be measured in steps rather than miles, that kind of contact must have been far more common. The result was interbreeding, sometimes accidental, perhaps sometimes encouraged. Over generations, local wild boar ancestry began to flood into domestic herds. This is where the old story started to fracture. By looking at modern European pigs alone, scientists had long faced a puzzle. If domestic pigs came from the Near East, why did modern European pigs look genetically so European? Why did so much of their ancestry seem to trace back not to Southwest Asia, but to the wild boar of Europe itself? One explanation was that pigs had been domesticated independently in Europe. That seemed plausible for a time. But ancient DNA allowed researchers to compare pigs from different periods directly rather than guessing backward from the present. And that changed everything. The genomes of early European domestic pigs still carried clear Near Eastern ancestry. Later pigs carried less and less of it. By around 3,000 years ago, most of that original ancestry had been swamped. Modern European domestic pigs retain only a small fraction of their ancestry from the Near Eastern wild boar populations that first entered the domestic process there. In broad terms, the founding pigs came from the Near East, but their descendants in Europe were steadily remade through long contact with European wild boar. It was, in effect, a near-complete genomic turnover. Imagine the scale of that. A domestic animal introduced by some of the first farmers in Europe survives not by remaining genetically intact, but by dissolving into the biology of the continent it enters. The herd continues. The species remains recognizably pig. Human management continues. But the ancestry under the skin is changing, century after century, until the original signature is reduced to a trace. And yet one trait appears to have lingered, a gene associated with black coat color, likely useful as a visible marker of domestication. That matters because it suggests that even while most of the imported ancestry was being replaced, people may still have been selecting certain domestic traits. In other words, this was not a return to wildness. It was something more interesting than that. Humans were maintaining the domestic role of pigs while allowing, or failing to prevent, major gene flow from wild populations. The domestic pig of Europe was not simply preserved. It was rebuilt. Now the jaw from the Baltic coast begins to look different. That animal, found among hunter-gatherers of the Ertbowl culture in northern Europe, appears to show that domestic pigs reached some foraging communities earlier than once believed, centuries before the full package of farming was established there. This was not just an issue of animal bones. It was evidence of contact, exchange, observation, curiosity, perhaps gift, trade, theft, or imitation. However it happened, the pig had crossed a social boundary before agriculture fully crossed it. A domestic animal was moving through a world where ways of life still overlapped. That is one of the reasons pigs are so revealing. They do not only tell us where farming went. They tell us how permeable the frontier between farmer and hunter could be. A pig can pass between societies more easily than an ideology. It can be butchered, bred, exchanged, copied, coveted. It can travel as meat, as livestock, as promise. If it appears in the wrong place, it may mean that the categories we rely on, farmer, forager, local, foreign, wild, domestic, were never as sealed as we wanted them to be. And the deeper scientists looked, the less singular the pig story became. In East Asia, the evidence points to a very different trajectory. Ancient and modern DNA from China suggests substantial long-term continuity between some of the earliest domestic pigs there and later Chinese domestic lineages. In the Middle Yellow River Basin, some of the maternal lineages seen in early pig remains persist deep into later history and into modern populations. That continuity stands in striking contrast to Europe. In China, the domestic story in some regions looks more stable, less overwhelmed by local wild ancestry, though not necessarily simple. Researchers still debate the exact number of domestication centers within China, and some regions show their own episodes of movement, replacement, and complexity. But the broad lesson is unmistakable: there was no universal pig pathway. One region saw imported domestic pigs genetically transformed after arrival. Another preserved much more of its early domestic continuity. In some areas, pigs seem to reflect deep local lineages. In others, they reflect dispersal, admixture, and later replacement. The truth ancient DNA has revealed is not that we were wrong about one location and right about another. It is that the very idea of a single pig origin story was too small for the evidence. Even the language of origins begins to buckle under that pressure. What does it mean to ask where pigs came from? Do we mean the first wild boar populations drawn into human settlements? The first communities to breed them intentionally? The first recognizable domestic body shape? The ancestry of later domestic herds? The spread of the animal into new continents? The answer changes depending on which pig, which place, and which century we mean. That matters because origins are powerful. They give us beginnings we can point to. They make history feel anchored. But pig domestication refuses to stay anchored. It happened through relationship rather than moment, through repeated contact rather than clean separation, through movement followed by mixture, through animals that kept one foot in the forest even while living beside human households. And perhaps that should not surprise us. Of all the major domestic animals, pigs may be among the least interested in becoming symbols of control. Sheep flock. Cattle submit to open grazing systems. Horses can be trained into visible partnership. Pigs remain something more ambiguous. Clever, adaptable, opportunistic, often half-independent. In many traditional systems they were not raised at a total distance from the wild. They moved through woods, waste heaps, settlement margins. They were useful precisely because they could convert scraps, mast, and marginal landscapes into meat. But that usefulness also made them biologically permeable. The domestic pig stayed close to the wild boar not because domestication failed, but because the human systems built around pigs allowed that closeness to continue. So the great reversal is this: ancient DNA did not reveal that pigs were never domesticated. It revealed that domestication was never the tidy severing we imagined. The first European domestic pigs really did arrive from the Near East. That part was true. But they did not remain what they had been. The pigs that helped accompany the spread of farming into Europe were gradually absorbed, altered, and genetically rewritten in their new environment. Meanwhile, in China, some domestic pig lineages show a continuity that Europe does not. Same species. Different histories. Different human worlds. Different outcomes. That is why the origin of pigs turns out to be larger than pigs. It is about how human expansion worked. How farming spread not as a perfect package but as an improvisation. How local ecologies pushed back. How wild populations were not merely conquered, but recruited into the domestic future. And how the animals that fed ancient households were also carrying a record of trade routes, frontier contact, failed containment, and the long negotiation between culture and landscape. The old question was, where were pigs first domesticated? The better question may be, how many times did humans begin remaking pigs, and how many times did pigs, by refusing to stay fully bounded, remake the human plan? And so we return to that damp jaw on the Baltic coast. What once looked like discarded bone now reads like testimony. Not only to an animal, but to a threshold moment in European prehistory. It belonged to a pig shaped by human intention, carrying ancestry tangled across continents, appearing in a place where categories had already begun to blur. In that small piece of bone lies the collapse of a simple story. The pig was never just local. Never just imported. Never just wild, or simply domestic. It was evidence of a world in transition. If you like documentaries that stay with the evidence long enough for it to change shape, you can subscribe and keep exploring with us. Because sometimes the most ordinary remains, a tooth, a jaw, a stain in ancient soil, turn out to contain a history far less settled than the one we inherited. And once you know that, that bone on the shoreline no longer looks like debris at all. It looks like the moment an old certainty quietly ended.